Welcome, everyone, to today's Aurora Institute webinar, Equitable Grading, a Competency-Based Education Entry Point and Core Practice. We have a wonderful panel here today. Joe Feldman, author of Grading for Equity and CEO of the Crescendo Education Group, Dr. Sonal Patel, the Assistant Superintendent of Education Services in San Leandro Unified in California, Dr. Jill Gartner, principal of Clark Street Community School in Wisconsin, along with two students, Everest and Camus. And I'm Lori Gagno, the Director of Competency Works at Aurora, and I'll be moderating today. Before we dive in, let's take a moment of pause for a land acknowledgement. The Aurora Institute acknowledges that this virtual webinar takes place on lands that have been home to Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. By focusing on the whole child, real-world application, and learning in context, competency-based education, CBE, uses similar principles to traditional Indigenous education. Whether intentional or not in the initial design, we acknowledge that CBE ideas reflect traditional Indigenous education approaches that long predate CBE. We want to take a moment to honor the ancestral grounds that we're collectively gathered upon and support the resilience and strength that Indigenous people have shown worldwide. Specifically, we reflect on the impact of colonization on Indigenous peoples through education systems that marginalize and suppress their traditional knowledge systems and ways of being. Today, I'm joining from Somerville, Massachusetts, on the ancestral lands of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and Namkeg peoples. As we get started, I welcome you to introduce yourselves in the chat with your name, role, organization, location, and if you'd like, a memory of a grade that you got. Today, we are recording this webinar, and we encourage you to share your learning from our time together. We also offer these meeting invitations to support our learning and engagement as a community, and I will read those as well. Bring good intentions and pay attention to impact, engage with agency and an open mind, accept and expect non-closure, have fun while doing good work. And a little bit about the Aurora Institute. Our mission is to drive the transformation of education systems and accelerate the advancement of breakthrough policies and practices to ensure high-quality learning for all. Today's webinar touches upon all core aspects of our work. We hope we are shifting our mental models and setting a vision for what it means to give grades, feedback, and report on the learning progress of students. We are sharing examples of how to build equitable grading into our grading policies. We're building our knowledge base of ways to use equitable competency-based grading and reporting to improve learning for all students. And we are gathering people to catalyze change and build the field. So we're super excited to do that together. And driving our work is Aurora's competency-based education definition that serves as an organizing framework for, sorry about that, for thinking about education transformation that centers students and their learning. Defining the essential competencies, both academic and the transferable skills and dispositions, is a first step for learning design and designing grading systems and pedagogical practices that are based on evidence of learning. So that's a feature today. Additionally, each point of this definition connects to the importance of grading and reporting on learning. If we start with our Aqua Circle student agency, when learners are empowered daily by knowing where they are in their learning and understanding how their grade reflects their efforts, they are better poised to participate. Meaningful assessment enables students to demonstrate what they know and can do. And then when we have that information, we can offer students personalized support in a timely manner. And we can allow learners to grow as they're ready with responsive pacing and make that progress based on demonstrated mastery. And then as learning goals are clear and we have the equitable culture systems and pedagogy to enable access to learning, we can provide flexible pathways to learn in different ways. So all of these really connect. So let's dive into grading for equity. Joe Feldman, we are so happy that you are here.
Well, thanks, Lori. And I'm just so grateful to be invited to be part of this great discussion. I'm Joe Feldman. I'm a former high school English and American history teacher. I was an assistant principal and then a principal of a couple high schools. I worked in the central office in a medium-sized district in Northern California and worked in the central office in New York City. And now I currently live in Oakland, California. And my journey to this was I wanted to figure out grading. It was something I couldn't get a handle on really as a teacher. Something nagged at me when I was an administrator, both at the site and district level. It was something that I just couldn't get my head around. And so started researching and talking with lots of folks and found that many of our practices that we use now are 100 years old. And there's lots of ways that we can improve how we grade to align with what we know about effective pedagogy and adolescent development and behavior and all kinds of real scholars in also the equity space, because in many ways, continuing to use these practices perpetuates achievement and opportunity disparities without us realizing it. And so started doing this work. And I'm just glad to have a little bit of time today to share with you a little bit about equitable grading and its intersection with competency-based education, and to be joined by some practitioners who are really realizing that intersection in their own work. So, grading really often seems like just kind of the plumbing of schools, not very exciting. You're just adding up points based on, how much a student did, and then you divide by the number possible, and there you go. But it's a lot more complex. Grading includes lots of decisions that teachers make around what categories do they use, and the percentages and scales, and how many points do students get, and what if it's late or missing. And ultimately, it's part of every pedagogical decision, because we have to decide when a student does something, am I going to grade it or not? And where does it fit in my grade book? And one of the challenges in grading that I found was that most teachers, including myself, get no training in how to do this critically important aspect of our practice. We have our own experiences having been graded. We are given some instruction and guidance from our schools or districts, but we have never had access to the research on grading. And so we have a very wobbly stool on which we're basing such important decisions that profoundly affect our students. And when I started doing this work, as I said, I saw that there was this long history of grading. And it really started in the Industrial Revolution. There were lots of ideas and beliefs about who we were trying to educate and what we believed about their potential and what we kind of world we were preparing students for. And all of that, it really doesn't apply to many of our ways that we currently think about grading and assessment. And yet, these are almost frozen in time. They're almost identical, what we do now to what we did a century ago, and we know so much more. So I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of traditional grading and just briefly talk about why they impact us so negatively in our work. The first is that, as I mentioned, that grading for most of us when we were growing up and in most schools and classrooms, it's success is by the number of points you accumulate over time. And so when teachers are describing, what does it take to have a B or to have an A, it's really just a breakdown of numbers. Can you animate forward? Yeah. Right. So that's kind of how we describe success in our classrooms and schools. And one of the ironies in this is that as a teacher, next slide, please. As a teacher, right, we know conceptually as experts in our field around what does it look like for a student to demonstrate A-level understanding of the Pythagorean theorem or the social, political, economic causes of the Civil War or anything like that. And yet we translate that all into a ratio of points earned over points possible. And the message that sends to students is, well, I guess my job in a school is to just get as many points as possible, to lift that ratio as high as possible. And when I struggle, next animate, when I struggle and I have challenges, the advice the teacher really is kind of left with is, well, you just got to work harder, just get more points. And then the student says, well, I'm trying. Like, is that what this is about? I just got to get more points. And I start haggling, and all I do is think about getting points. And the result of that is that I, as a student, become so distanced from what I'm supposed to be doing here in a school, what I'm supposed to be learning. And the expectations about what I'm supposed to do by the teacher become very opaque to me as a student. And the result of that, as I said, is that now success in school is not about learning. It's just accumulating points independent of learning. And students feel disempowered. Like, I have no access, I have no understanding as a student of what's expected other than to get points. So now it's just a hustle and a game. The second impact that I'll talk about today is that our traditional grading doesn't just make it harder for students, it actually makes it harder for us as teachers to communicate accurately and clearly where students are in their learning. And it even misleads them many times. So next slide, please. When I'm deciding, what a grade should be, and I'm certainly want the grade to reflect a level of content understanding that my students have. And maybe that's from tests or summative assessments or things like that. But I'm including lots of other things, like how they did on their homework and quizzes and extra credit and participation and effort and growth. And I'm putting a whole lot of information into a tiny little container. And this is all different kinds of information. And a lot of this information, if you click it, are really susceptible to biases, right? Many times when I'm trying to describe participation or evaluate it, I have an archetype of what that looks like, what participation looks like in schools. And usually it's what I look like when I'm working hard or when I'm learning. And I compare students to that. I'm putting all this information and many of it very subjective into this tiny little container. And the result of that is that then when a student gets a grade, can you click again? Right? I don't know as a student or as any person outside that classroom what that B represents, in what alchemical relationship all those different things are. So I might get a B for being, knowing the content very, very well, but turning in assignments late every day. Or I might get a B because I don't know the content very well, but I participate and I'm a great, just an angel of a student in the classroom, right? Because I'm putting so many different things into a single letter, it starts to warp the accuracy of the grade. And again, this is not an indictment of teachers. This is what we've inherited from the Industrial Revolution. And so the system-wide impact of that collapsing, or what's sometimes called omnibus grading, when you're putting all kinds of things together, and the fact that because teachers don't get trained or get any education, we all do it differently. The result of that is that there becomes this inaccurate and unreliable information about where students are in their learning, which then leads for decisions to get made that aren't based on accurate and valid and reliable information. I may have students that are getting tutoring that don't need it, or repeating a class that actually don't need it, or students who might need additional support and they're not showing up on our radar because they're just students who we love, and so they're getting their points bumped up. And one of the things that we found, we've done lots of research around this, and the most recent one is a comprehensive study that we did where we looked at 33,000 grade test score pairings. In other words, we looked at courses that where a student was assigned a grade, and that course has an end of course exam that's from the state or AP exam, some other outside body that is designed to test to assess the student's understanding of the course content. So we looked at those, and what we found was that 60% of the grades that were assigned did not match the score on the standardized test. And I don't love standardized tests by any means. There's all kinds of flaws, but 60% mismatch is very, very high. 40% of those were inflated, which means that the grade was higher than the test score. And we can expect that to happen sometimes, right? Student has a bad day on the test, teacher knows the student better. 40% is still very high. But what we also saw was that 1 out of 6 grades that students were assigned were what we call depressed, which means that the grade was lower than how the student did on that content assessment. And that's a little harder to kind of stomach because we wouldn't expect that a student would actually know more and demonstrate higher understanding than the grade would reflect. And what we came away with, and what we've heard from college admissions folks and folks from all over the country, is what's happening is that students are being given false information about their readiness for the next level. Either that they are told that they are less ready than they actually are, or that they're told that they're more ready than they actually are. And for the students who get grade depression, they're actually being prohibited from accessing opportunities because the grade is lower than their actual readiness. And so what we've seen is that we need to change our grading. And folks who are familiar with competency-based education get that in ways that I'll talk about even in a little bit, and you'll hear more about from practitioners. Equitable grading, it really has 3 pillars, and this is based on the research across a number of fields. We want our grades to be accurate reflections of what students understand and know. We want grades to be bias resistant, so we want to counteract the institutional biases and prevent our implicit biases from infecting the grade. And we want our grades to be motivational, so students aren't just in an endless, Pac-Man search for points, but it's building intrinsic motivation and students' sense of efficacy and their skills at self-regulation. And there's a whole lot in this, and we are just not going to be able to get into all of this. But I wanted to kind of give one example of how this operates. But first I want to share kind of the quick overview of the practices, right? This is where grades don't include the 0 to 100 scale, averaging over time, behaviors, performance on formative assessments, group grades, and extra credit. And instead, the grade is reflecting a student's understanding of the course content, looking at where they are at the end of their learning, looking at explicit outcomes with retakes and multiple opportunities to demonstrate, using a 0 to 4 scale, and using rubrics and standard scales to explicitly describe outcome mastery. So I want to kind of talk about this last example as a way to correct and improve the way that we grade and kind of detach ourselves from this traditional inertia of grading. So when a teacher knows what A-level understanding of the Pythagorean theorem is, what they do is they actually explicitly describe it for the students in specific ways, in ways that they can understand and then internalize, so that now they know what the expectations are clearly, right? It's not how many points do I get, it's what level of understanding do I describe? And that's a target now that is clear and doesn't move. And by lifting the veil and using rubrics and proficiency scales, instead of a point ratio and accumulation, it's explicit descriptions of the levels of performance. Click the next one there, right? And that's just one example. But what we found from the second part of this comprehensive study, looking at 33,000 grades, we trained over 250 teachers in not just this practice around explicit proficiency scales and rubrics, but all the different practices. And what we found was that when teachers learned how and were given access to the information and started applying these practices, there was a greater increase in the strength of correlation between the grade and the external assessment compared to a control group. Grade inflation went down and grade depression went down. And what we found is, which often translated into fewer D's and F's and slightly fewer A's. And what we found is that it didn't affect all groups the same, that there was a reduction in the persistent achievement disparities by race and income and special education designation. And one of the most interesting things for me that I didn't think would be the case is that 40% of the teachers who were in the professional development felt like that professional development experience by itself made them more interested and likely to stay in the district and in the teaching profession. And I think at a time when we really are worried about teacher attrition, to find ways to fill this knowledge gap for them can be hugely fulfilling, and address what teachers know was information and a part of their practice that they just haven't had access to understanding and to bolstering. And it wasn't just in this study, but very briefly, I want to just say kind of what we've seen trends as we've worked with really over hundreds of districts and schools and even universities, and thousands, over 12,000 teachers over the past 10 years in this work, is that when teachers have access to the education and research, it is now a much more stable and balanced tool that's still embedded in their context and reflects their unique approach to teaching and learning, but is grounded. And we've found that there are many pathways for teachers to access this information. We as an organization, and I'll put the link in later, partners with workshops and coaching and an online course and other things. But teachers access this through reading my book and other article reads, all kinds of ways. And what we found over time is not just in this study, but in the past, is that for students, there's a reduction in grade inflation and depression, a reduction in achievement disparities, and then qualitatively, teachers talk about, and students tell us, how they are less stressed and more focused on points, and they describe their progress in the language of the discipline. They say, not I'm 2 points away from an A, but if I can just apply negative coefficients to the distributive property, I'll have an A, which not all of us know that tune, but to some of us, it's music. And what we find is that teachers gravitate, and it appeals to them across the geographical spectrum, political spectrum, in their context, whether it be rural, urban, suburban schools. Everybody has value out of this by improving the accuracy and fairness of their grades. And it can ultimately result in policy. All right. So the last thing I'll talk about is this wonderful relationship between equitable grading and competency-based education. And what we have seen is that there's lots of great connections that actually go back and forth. So first of all, for people who enter through equitable grading, they may think that it's a set of quick fixes, right? Just do retakes, but it's actually incredibly complex. And the questions that are asked in starting to understand equitable grading, like, well, how can my scale be mathematically sound? And how can I describe clearly my expectations and be able to describe them on a scale? Leads to, well, what are my outcomes and what do I want students to know and be able to do? Which gets us into some of the deep questions of competency-based education. And it functions in the reverse. We have found that for folks who are pursuing competency-based education very early in the process, they have to figure out their grading. Because if I have a portrait of a graduate, and I think that is a better way to describe what we expect students to know and be able to do when they leave this place, and I then have to think about what courses and curricula support that, how am I going to assess whether students have met those? I have to describe and report where students are, not just at the end, have they done it or not, but periodically and regularly over time, so that caregivers, students, external folks all know where students are on that learning trajectory. And traditional grading doesn't allow us to do that in ways that align with competency-based education. So again, hopefully that was a whirlwind overview, but it's a way that we think about the value of equitable grading and its relationship, synergistic one, with competency-based education.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, so much to unpack. So next, let's hear what it looks like in practice as we hear from San Leandro Unified's equitable grading journey with Dr. Sonal Patel. And we're so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's lovely to spend the afternoon with you all, and just good to see you all. So I'm Sonal Patel. I work in San Leandro Unified. You can look at the next slide. And it's just been a joy to grow up professionally in one school district. San Leandro is across the bay from San Francisco. We're right next to Oakland, California. And we are a small to medium-sized district. We serve about 9,000 students, mostly students of color. About a quarter of our students are emergent bilinguals. We boast 38 languages in our school district and are just really proud of our community. I've kind of came up through San Leandro as a student teacher, K-1 teacher, associate principal at the high school, and then working in central office as the director of teaching and learning. And now I get to oversee educational services. And our journey in San Leandro Unified is really about, engaging in this work pre-book, starting back in 2015, providing professional learning and engaging in policy work at the district level and at the school site level to build a really solid foundation to address the kind of inequities that show up in all parts of school, but specifically in grading. And those inequities have big impacts on teaching and learning. And so we found out quickly if we wanted to move the needle on how our students experience daily school and feel engaged and a sense of belonging in school, that grading was a place that a lot of the work was hiding in that place. And so our aim over the past 9 years has been to better support our teachers and students to ensure that grades accurately reflect student achievement in standards-based learning, which is a way of saying that they don't reflect a hidden curriculum or a set of obstacles that largely kids of color and students experiencing a lot of traditional barriers in school will find the business end of very quickly and disengage from. And so that's a big part of our work. You might wonder what got us into this work. So back in 2015, when I was first coming off of working at the high school and a new director of teaching and learning for our K-12 district, we have a large comprehensive high school that serves everyone in the community. It's built to serve about 2,800 students. And we have 2 large middle schools alongside a continuation school at that time. We were engaging in a secondary schools redesign, wanting to better understand how to make our big comprehensive schools feel more personal, more responsive, and to move the teaching away from what we had inherited as a leadership team that was kind of a little bit of the pedagogy of poverty on if kids were doing not well in English language arts, then just double block them. If they're not doing well in math, double block them. And that slowly pulled away from kids being in broad courses of study and in the kind of integrated, thematic, real world learning that actually motivates kids to come to school, right? So we started to started this committee to look at how we could do grades 6 through 12 better. And in those findings came suggestions around building advisories and office hours and block schedules. And a big part of that work was also moving to more project-based learning and integrated teaching across content areas. As we began to dive in to the kind of professional learning that kind of work involves, we're going to go back to the last slide. As we started to dive into the kind of work that involves, it involves teachers really working across departments and course alikes. And it became clear that looking at students' grades as a form of readiness or where they were wasn't working for us that well. We had a lot of inconsistencies around gradings, and that was leading to some of these drivers that are listed on the left of the slide. Incorrect placements. We had students who were doing well on standardized tests, yet not showing great grades in their coursework, vice versa. Sort of pointing to what Joe described earlier around grade inflation and deflation that had little to do with how the students actually mastered content, but more around how they were jumping through certain routines and practices, not necessarily linked to competency-based education, but rather following rituals and norms in classes around bringing their pencil or checking a binder or forgetting things. We were noticing high DNF rates, and that those DNF rates didn't seem to be changing even as we were loading up intervention classes or rethinking with new curriculum. We weren't really moving the needle. And then as we started to really look between courses, we were noticing that students were having vastly different experiences between, let's say, the very same English 1 class or biology class. There was a lot of discrepancies between those things. And so the need to look at this pushed us into, I would say, having to think a little bit more critically around how grades were working. And at that time, we called the initiative Assessing Student Learning Accurately, because we were really not even thinking about just grading, but really looking at assessment practices as a whole and how they didn't reflect what our students were necessarily able to do or what they knew. With those drivers and wanting to attend to those through what became the work that is captured in the book, Grading for Equity, we developed a list of needs or challenges as an organization, right? Especially for our 2 middle schools and high school. We found that there was a big need to do professional learning on grading. In fact, with Joe's help, when we did a kind of survey of our teaching community and our administrators, our principals, we found that less than 5% of them had any professional learning on grading. That means 95% of the folks doing all the grading and running of schools have never really had instruction on what grading is or what it means. We found the need to do things differently in terms of our infrastructure. We realized that our grading system, we use a student information system that a lot of folks in California used called ARIES. A lot of our blended learning platforms and the grading systems that are built within it were all built on these 100-point scales that naturally overweight the bottom of the scale, the F. Lots of things were needed for us to really think about where are some of the technical places in our organization that make it so that folks are just doing business as usual. And even when they're trying to think untraditionally around really looking at what students know and kind of shift towards more competency-based education and equitable grading practices, we have these hard systems in place that sort of push them back. Through that, we realized we also needed to look at our policies around reporting on student achievement, our board policies, and to address any past attempts or missteps in either professional learning or in other initiatives that maybe, were counterintuitive to what we were trying to move forward. For example, we had initiatives in the past around, don't give a 0 if a student doesn't turn something in, or certain, rules that we had made as an organization in a sort of attempt to address the power of the 0. Kind of Joe spoke to it a little bit earlier. And while those attempts might have come from a good place, sometimes when you create little policies or rules in a top-down way without doing the sort of deeper learning underneath, folks just shift the burden and find workarounds to address the sort of dilemma of grading without getting to some of the core issues that can only be attended to with deep shifts in how we use our pedagogy or how we shift our teaching. So with that in mind, just want you to, you're doing a lot of listening out there, webinar folks, but the chat is open to you. So if you want to put in there for each other, as you're thinking about what brought you to this webinar, what are your current drivers, or what was your motivation to log on at this time of day during a very busy time of the week, during a busy month? What are your current drivers or motivations to engage in equitable grading or grading for mastery or competency-based education? And who shares these drivers with you? The ones that I was listing, they really came out of a design committee that had teachers and counselors and principals and board members and folks at the central office and classified staff. And that was not that everybody was involved in designing our grading for equity training or work. We all saw the issue from which that became something that we wanted to engage in as a group. So feel free to share in the chat and we'll keep going. So wanting to start the work based on those drivers and knowing what our lift would be, we began a model back in 2015-16 of workshops. They started with the day kickoff and then 6 half-day workshops throughout the year. We began with a group that we knew wanted to start a little bit, but we also wanted to bring people who weren't the usual suspects because we wanted to learn how they learned and be able to see sort of what the challenges would be with a group that wasn't necessarily all in. And so we started with the leadership team at our comprehensive high school and a middle school. And we asked them to sort of bring a buddy. They engaged in 6 half-day workshops throughout the year. In between, they had coaching sessions with Crescendo group and Joe at the time. And, along the way, they built the bones for action research because that was really the foundation underneath the PD rollout. And it was a chance to try out new practices, to find, you know, maybe someone wanted to learn how to not grade homework or to, you know, give retakes, and they engaged in that work through an action research cycle. And so just thinking about how the PD design is important and how that PD design can build capacity across many initiatives. We've now used that action research model in other initiatives that we do because it was a model that really built on what we know is important towards change, which is building collective efficacy. And so that was really great to not just learn the content and engage in the inquiry around redesigning the way we think about grading and teaching and learning, but also have a new way of doing PD. That led us to the need to go ahead and start to look at policy changes. And this policy piece comes last because it would be really easy, I think, in the seat that I sit in at the time as a director of teaching and learning, and then eventually as an assistant superintendent, to say, we're just going to change the policy because enough of us have read the book now that it's come out. Enough of us have been trained as a first coat. We'll just change the policy, and we know this is good for kids, and this is great for teaching and learning. We didn't do it that way. We did multiple years of rolling out the professional learning from 2015 up until 2021, of doing lots and lots of professional learning to bring people to the table and to understand the ups and downs of what real implementation of changing your practice looks like, because we didn't want people just making technical changes in their gradebook. We knew it was deeper than that, right? And so here's one of the policy shifts that you see in our administrative regulation around reporting on student achievement. And it's basically this idea of wanting our teachers to move more towards grading work more heavily towards the end, right, when students have had a chance to develop, and that there's lots of moments for formative assessment, and that work that students are using as practice doesn't become part of their grade, and that we really have a hard line between the work that they do that represents mastery versus the dispositions and important competencies that they show up around softer skills, that those are important, but that those shouldn't be in the place where we give a grade that's meant to show academic mastery. And so that's just an example, and if you go to our website, you'll see it. And just little quick outcome here as I close. You'll see on this, you know, we have instructional coaches in San Leandro who have been the real fueling source behind the PD and the working side by side with teachers, and also getting some of this data for us around showing a course where everybody's teaching biology. And in semester 1, you have 6 different teachers. And our goal is for those students to have a predictability around it not being dependent which teacher you get, how you do, right? That your mastery should show up the same in all the classes in a common course. And teachers 4 through 6 are more aligned in equitable grading practices. They've been through the training, and you can see there the reduction in what Joe called grade inflation and deflation, that there's not, there's more students that are sort of, more aligned in terms of there's not overweighting of the F. You'll also see that in those classes there might not be as many A's when you start to take away bringing something to the school potluck, right? Doesn't make it to your grade. Things like that we've all probably experienced, if we're honest, in some of our classes. So this is just a slide to show that alignment, and a quick quote from one of our fabulous teachers at our high school, Alex Bright. And I'll read the part in blue. Actually, let me read the first 2 sentences. The formative, summative aspect has been life-changing for not just the students, but me. Students feel safer in their learning with low-stakes formative assessments, which barely affect their grade, and they are more prepared and invested in the summative piece that has come from all the preparation leading up to it. So I think this is a great place to close, that, you know, those years of doing the professional learning, you know, especially through action research, not only has it rendered a change in terms of what students experience in terms of less obstacles to being able to show what they know in a clear way, but also our educators just feeling more, just feeling happier and more effective in their work, because there's a more direct link to what they're doing and how students are showing up. Thanks for letting me share.
You missed my thank you. You had to read lips. Thank you, Sonal. Our next story is from Clark Street Community School, and it's one that starts with the rethinking of the learning system overall, as Joe talked about. To start with, we're going to be competency-based from the start. Dr. Jill Gertner, Everest, and Camus, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having us, and we are so excited to be here, and I'm very excited to be able to raise up the voices of some students. You can go on to the next slide, Lori. Because I think you heard about all of the hard work. You heard about the deep shifts that need to take place. And I think what we can represent is, I think as educators, sometimes we begin to believe that that lack of motivation that we see in students is actually coming from them. And the truth is, it's coming from the system that has created a lack of motivation over time. And for us, that was our big question. So we are in year 13. We are a public instrumentality charter school, the Middleton Cross Plains Area School District, first string suburb outside of Madison. And our mission is to democratically cultivate a community of engaged learners and to serve as a resource for educators and a catalyst for reform in education. And so the picture that is there, we had 10 years of being in a building by ourselves across a parking lot from the traditional high school. And 3 years ago, the district completed a significant renovation project, and it gave us the opportunity to really live our mission of saying, if you're going to build this small, innovative zone of education, can we actually learn how to learn from it as a whole system? So we are now co-located with the traditional high school that is one of the top schools in the state from a data perspective. And those of you that know Dane County know that Dane County has one of the worst equity gaps in the country. So the equity question, living right here outside of Madison, being a UW grad myself, Gloria Lansing-Billings, lives in our heads. And the questions of, for me, representation really matters. And in places like Middleton, where we will be unlikely get to a place where our adult population represents our student population well, it's all the more reason why it's critical that we turn over the power to students and really look at a learner-centered model. So that is what we have been doing, and you can go on to the next slide, Lori. While our opening 13 years ago put us in front of Education Reimagined, when I heard them at the then iNACOL conference many years ago and heard their pillars about learner-centered design, I was like, yes, that is what we're doing, and that is what we're all about. And really doing it from a lens of how do we ensure that every learner has the opportunity to know themselves well, and produce their best work, and really deeply engage and take ownership over their learning. So that learner agency is deeply tied into the competency-based model that we have. And obviously we're here to talk about competency-based, so that's where we're gonna focus most of our time. So if you wanna go on to the next slide, we are also in a partnership with Mastery Transcript. So students at Clark Street are producing a mastery transcript, which is what they will use to tell their stories as they leave us. So whether that's going on to a post-secondary experience, to a job, to an internship, they are creating a story of themselves that is all about, this is who I am as a learner. And I saw some questions in the chat about, can you do this in the high school level, and can students get into college, and can they be successful in college? And I would say we're here to say, yes, absolutely. It's worth putting in the hard work to make that transition from a traditional context to one that really is competency-based and learner-empowered, because it really does result in amazing outcomes, and students are well prepared for whatever comes next. So for us, we really look at equitable assessment as something that is liberatory. How do we ensure that every learner leaves us knowing that it is their education and that it is our job to provide them an excellent education? So that is the hope of that's kind of the design and the goal of all of ours. So we have a set of core proficiencies in reading, writing, communication, research, mathematical modeling, that we have students being assessed on all of the time. So they don't get any grades, but they get a lot of feedback, and the students will talk a little bit to their experience related to that. In each one of those areas, there is a common set of rubrics that students are seeing over and over again through the time that they're here. So they know what proficiency looks like. They know where they are as it relates to proficiency in those areas, and they're continually getting feedback and giving each other feedback, which is also a really powerful piece of this, is that the learners learn to understand, how do I give effective feedback? And they learn that by giving and taking effective feedback, they improve their work and they feel better about it. And in the process, they are significantly more engaged in their learning because it's meaningful to them. So the students each are going to share a little bit about one of their learning experiences. The design of our school is a combination of interdisciplinary seminars and personalized projects. And I think each of them are going to talk about one or the other of those. But for me, the story of the students is just such a critical piece of saying to educators, yes, we know we can do it differently. And yes, it can have different results. And it is worth that effort to put in to really think differently about it. So I'm going to kick it over to Everest, who's going to tell you a little bit about one of his learning experiences.
So at the end of each semester, we do a presentation of learning, which is just a reflection on a learning experience from the semester and what we've learned from it and how we grew from it. So second semester last year, I did my presentation of learning on an independent project I did where I went on a road trip and I learned about fishing culture in the Great Lakes region. And so I wrote my presentation of learning on this and I did my first draft and I really, really hated it. I wanted this presentation to be something that was amazing and reflected this like really awesome experience that I had, but my writing like did not match my experience. And I was ready to just start over and do a whole different topic, which I really wanted to share my experience of this. So I was kind of sad that I was going to start over. But I got feedback from one of my friends and a bunch of teachers, and they helped me turn it into something that I really, really am proud of. And I rewrote the whole thing, but I kept like the whole same ideas in it because of all the feedback that I got. And the feedback is so ingrained into all the processes at our school that I don't know where I'm going with that. But I'm just really proud of this project, and it stemmed from the feedback that I was able to get. And the feedback, not just on this specific piece, I've been able to learn about a lot about myself and my writing skills and what I need to improve on and what I'm really good at. And it's helped me get better at giving and receiving constructive criticism, which I think is really important.
And then Kamo is going to share one of his experiences.
Yeah, so last year I took a class called Clark Tank, and it was sort of based off the show called Shark Tank, and I had to come up with like a product that I would come up with to help consumers. And so I learned a lot about entrepreneurship through that class, and the feedback that I received in the class through my peers and my teachers were invaluable on my final process, and I would not have felt as confident, or I don't think I would have received the skills that I did and the confidence to present in front of a large audience.
And I think the thing for me that I consistently hear from students, I hear some of the like, obviously feedback is nothing new. I think the piece for switching to a competency-based model and moving away from a system where grades are assigned by an adult. And sometimes grades are assigned by adults in ways that don't feel as if the students understand where they came from, or as Joe said earlier, right, it becomes this game of accruing points. In a competency-based model, the ownership that the students have over the feedback and over understanding what they are getting out of it changes the entire dynamic. So yes, of course, feedback is important. And the competency-based model that really empowers students to say, I want to dig in deeply here. These pieces matter to me, and it gives clarity and transparency in what they're working towards, makes a significant difference in then the experience for the learners. And as you heard both Joe and Sonal talk about, in the satisfaction of the educators as well.
Thank you, Everest, Jill, and Kamu. There are, yeah, it's great to hear two systems starting from such very different places. And I think that's one of the headlines that I want to frame our Q&A. We only have just a few minutes of Q&A, and I see one in the Q&A. I saw there's some more in the chat. So if you want to use the Q&A function, that's great. We probably have just a time for a few. But Heather asks, how does this approach differ from the Marzano competency-based learning approach? And we're maybe not going to go into the details here, but we can think of like competency-based education as it's not one pathway for students, right? We hear, right, a very personalized learning model, right? At Clark Street, we hear a different entry point, right? In San Leandro, they're not necessarily starting with a whole competency-based education redesign, but their work, right, to improve equitable experiences and grading is starting to like lead to some of those questions. So there's really a range of different ways, and you know, the Marzano model is one approach, right? And so there's different things about how are those learning expectations designed, how, you know, and that's going to differ from system to system. So it's not one size fits all for students. It's not one size fits all for systems and schools either. And I think that's part of the beauty, but also part of the challenge, right? There's not a single right way. So how do we build our shared understanding and be able to give feedback to our systems, right, in order to create systems that really serve students' needs? So that's hopefully that, Heather, that answers, like there might be some specific pieces. I don't know if Sonal, you want to say anything about looking at the Marzano model, but I think the idea here is that there's a range of models and it's really like looking at how are they similar in different dimensions. We've got another question here, I think. So I think this is a question for Everest and Kamu about how, maybe you can talk a little bit about your own motivation to learn. Do you feel sometimes that there's still this idea of like, how do I get the highest level as possible? How, you know, is there that mindset of still going after the grade, but now you're just going after a competency level? And maybe you want to just share a little bit of your experience for this one question.
I think for me, I am chasing that like highest level of like proficiency, but not because I like want to check off the box like, oh yes, I'm at this level. I want to get there because I want my skills to improve. So it's not like chasing the points, it's chasing the skills, if that makes sense.
Makes sense to me. Hopefully that helps to answer. And I'll just add that as a general rule, like this is a culture shift, right? It's not like a switch that you flip, right? And that now the rest of the world doesn't, you know, we're like, we used to care about grades and now we only care about learning. There's still like a relationship, right, with how the world perceives grades, right? So there's like a gradual shift, but I think that really captures it, that the focus is really on what am I learning, not just am I checking off the boxes for the purpose of a grade, which hopefully, you know, as kids get high grades, they learn in the process, but that's not the focus, right, in the traditional system, right? And now we're really shifting that focus to learning. Mike has a question about improvement in instructor retention after moving to an equity grading model at San Leandro Unified. And Joe, you mentioned this as a general finding, right? That teachers reported, like just the training itself made them want to stay. So do you want to speak a little bit to that, Sonal?
Yeah, I think, you know, there's a few things kind of that work together to make teachers feel like they want to stay. And one of them is the model of the professional learning, this idea that like they actually get to be in a form of education that they didn't experience K-12 as teachers, where they're getting to like learn and make mistakes and you know, sort of build their own understanding of how student learning works. I think that sometimes we want our teachers to sort of move to an alternative model, right? Like overnight, and they actually need to be able to be given a place to be able to make mistakes. They're doing that out loud in a large public school system with parents who want traditional notions of schooling, even because we're educating the community at the same time. And so I think that something we've heard overwhelmingly in the feedback that we do at the end of each session and at the end of our, you know, the coaching cycles is that not only was the format of the professional learning motivating and made them feel, you know, made them shift and feel really valued, but it also opened them up to how they had been using grades as a way of sort of punishing or withholding, and that moving away from that, while scary, to think about how to shift towards something else and to move towards rubrics and to, sort of move, was giving them this feeling of like, I'm just really not done in education. There's so much still for me to learn about how to do this. And so I think that in that way, it's been really powerful.
I just want to add two things. One to the, I think it was the prior question around sort of grades themselves. And I think one of the things that we sometimes fall into is saying, well, if you're going to grade, then it has to be A through F, and it has to be some points, and it has to be some calculations. Like, it can have that. But I really think of grades really as a way to formally describe where students are in their learning. And so schools come up with lots of ways to do that, letters being one of them, but there are also descriptors, other kind of targets, other ways of communicating. And that's really what we're talking about, is making sure that students know, and people outside the school know, including caregivers, where students are relative to our expectations of where we want them to go, and the targets. And what for students, they do want to succeed, right? But it's kind of a life building exercise where I want to lose 10 pounds. I want to make sure that I'd love to be able to play the piano better, right? When I start to understand that there are targets and goals, and to be as clear as I can on those goals, and to get feedback as I approach or deviate from my progress toward that goal, I start to get greater empowerment and a greater sense of self-efficacy around this. And that's what we see. The last thing I'll say is what Dr. Patel was referencing around sort of how teachers feel about their own work. We've heard teachers talk about how this brings joy back into teaching, that teachers didn't go into the profession so they could be sort of bean counters and accountants and like manage student behaviors with points. Like, well, you raised your hand, so you get points, and you didn't raise your hand, you don't get points today. They went in because they want to teach and they want kids to learn. And so what they're finding is when they can get out of this traditional system and be much more communicating explicitly with students about what the learning goals are, and construct a different kind of feedback mechanism and a broader range of assessments, they actually feel greater fulfillment in their own work. And it reminds them why they went into teaching in the first place.
Yeah, I really appreciate that, Joe. Thank you. And that's a great transition to say there's a lot more here, both in the immediate questions, and I encourage people to check out, like, there are lots of stories on the Competency Works blog of how different schools and learning communities are making this transition. There's great resources on Joe's website. We'll share that as well. Like, we can learn from what it looks like to make this transition. There's stories about who people are involving, who the stakeholders are and how people have involved them. So there's a real treasure trove of experiences. And we hope that you have, even though we didn't get to everything, that you have some actionable ideas from this webinar. And we want you to explore these additional resources. I also want to take an opportunity to share our partners at our friends at here I am, I'm out of order, right? So we're going to put these links in the chat here. This is a study tour. This was shared earlier.
I just want to say, this is, as Lori was saying, there's lots of pathways. This is an opportunity for leaders from districts and schools to come together to learn what are some possible pathways to go through this work with each other and from a model district.
Yep, and to take stock of where you're at and think about what are our assets as we go into this work. And I also want to invite Catherine Thorne to share a little bit about this program. Speaking of teacher training being an important element of this, for digging in deeper in this innovative master's program that also includes some coursework around experimenting with equitable grading and competency-based models.
Thanks, Lori. Thank you, everybody, for joining today and for the invitation. Out of all the sessions I could have joined, this is incredible. What a great conversation. And I absolutely love listening firsthand to students in particular. So kudos to the two of you guys. Thank you for sharing your stories. I'm here today to just talk briefly about a really innovative graduate program being offered in partnership through Two Revolutions and Spalding University. At its core, the program seeks to teach about while allowing participants to actually learn within a learner-centered and equity-centered experience. The program was designed around 3 core goals, and I'm just going to take a quick minute to talk about each one. The first goal was focused on outcomes. Starting with what we know we want to be true for our K-12 learners, we then backwards mapped to identify the knowledge, skills, and mindsets that educators and leaders would need in order to design differently. The result is a degree pathway that is truly focused on developing the educators our students deserve. An example of what happens when we think this way is a course that is in the first term that participants in this program will take, and it's called Learner-Centered Approach to Communicating Growth and Outcomes. Among others, this course is rooted in Joe Feldman's work and aims to give educators specific strategies to shift feedback and communication practices in the short term within their classrooms, while advocating for needed grading and reporting changes at the systems level in the long term. And so that's sort of the approach that all of our courses take, is really thinking about, if we're moving towards competency-based, what can we do now to pilot and to test and to grow our own skill set and change practices and mindsets while we build for the long-term systems changes. Knowing that educators create what they experience, our second goal was to deeply model that type of learning that we want for our K-12 students in a way that's appropriate for our adult learners. So the courses are designed using a cycle of learn, apply, revise, and reflect. So application-based, job-embedded approach enables participants to experience firsthand the methodologies that we're actually asking them to implement. That's going to help educators not only create, but to also empathize with students as they begin to shift their practices within their classrooms to understand the student experience. And finally, the third goal is around impact. The program is designed to be both broad and deep, with a key differentiator being its cost effectiveness. We're trying to bring educators together from across contexts, learn from and with one another. So the program is being offered at a tuition rate of just over $13,000 total, making it accessible while maintaining high value. For folks who are earning their second master's, 12 credits would actually transfer into an EDD program with Spalding University. So I know that this has been a long session. You've got a lot of information that's been shared with you. If you feel inspired or you want to learn more, please connect with me after the webinar, share the website. We've got an FAQ deck there so that you can kind of poke around, and we've got some upcoming information sessions that we would love to have you join to learn more. Thanks for the time.
Thank you, and apologize for going just a couple minutes over, but we appreciate it. Competency-based learning about competency-based models for educators. So yes, thank you, Catherine. And when this closes, you'll get a survey, or it might be in the chat. Please give us your feedback when the webinar closes, and we have a next webinar in January about the research behind a competency-based education transformative learning agenda. So that should be really exciting, and really reach out if you've got questions. Check out all the resources that have been shared, and we'll also share the recording and recap those resources as well for all of you.